You would have understood what is literals in Java in the previous chapter. In this chapter, we will discuss about another important element, or rather the core of programming, which is variables. So we'll discuss about variables, different types of scopes that we have for variables, what is a member variable and how they can be used in a typical Java program. Variables are the heart of programming, because whenever you want to compute or solve a problem, right, you need to represent the data of your client application, for example, or data given by the client for an application. How do you represent that data? You want to represent that by holding or referring in some place, and that is what a variable is all about. And variables are part of every program, and it is basically a unit of storage in a program where you store some content, some data. And variable basically contains an identifier, a type, and optional initializer. So we discussed what is an identifier in the previous chapter. So how do you declare a variable? So let's take a look at it. So let's see how we can declare a variable. So here you could see that I have an identifier that it is of type int. So we have int x comma y comma z. So now this represents a statement where I am basically declaring a variable of a type. So we have an identifier x, y or z, and this is of type integer. Optionally, I can also have an initializer. For example, you look at the second statement here, int length is equal to 10 comma width is equal to 13. So it's of type int and the identifier is length, and the optional initialization value we have given in the program is 10. So this is another example. Similarly, we can create a byte variable of name z and the value is 25. Similarly, double or character. So these are the ways in which you can declare a simple variable to be used in a program. We also have dynamic initialization. For example, you could see here int area is equal to length times width. What is that? So length is a separate variable we have defined here, width is a separate variable, and now I am creating a new variable area which is dynamically initializing the value based on the value of length and width by default. So that's a simple example where variables can also be initialized dynamically. And there are different scopes for variables in Java. So we have a variable with class scope, and we have an instance scope and method scope. So what is a class scoped variable? It is nothing but a static or a constant. So a class variable is nothing but a variable defined with a static keyword as a prefix. This variable is initialized when the class is loaded, and we don't need to have any object created to access this variable. So we can directly say, if we have a class ABC, I can basically say ABC dot a variable x, for example. So class name dot x represents that particular variable which can be used for accessing that variable or assigning some value to that variable in Java. If we already have an instance, let's take a simple example, a student, and I want to assign some variable, a value to that. So that is where we have instance variable, which is also referred to as a member variable of a particular class. For example, in the previous chapter, we discussed about rectangle class, and inside the rectangle class, we have width as a member variable. And this member variable typically gets initialized when the object is created. You can modify the value of that particular variable when you are accessing some methods or whenever you are doing some changes within the method. So this is the concept of an instance variable. And sometimes when you basically are implementing or writing a method, you might need to represent the data in some variable within that particular method, and that is called method variable, where within the method we can declare certain variables and use them, which is useful for that particular method scope for computing some logic within that particular method. So that is what is a method variable, and it is created when the method is executed, and it will be released typically when the method execution is complete. And I cannot access them outside the method scope. So that is where we have three scopes to summarize. So if you look at this diagram, it basically gives you an idea. So if we have a class, so which is represented by this rectangle here, and there could be multiple variables within the class, and their class variables represented by this star. And then you have an object created, and within an object you might have certain instance variables, and every object might have certain methods. So whenever you have a method, there could be a variable assigned within that particular method represented by a method variable icon here. So as you see in the diagram, the scope is also very much simple to understand. So a method variable is the least scope, and they can also access instance variable, or optionally you can also access class variable, very much possible. And instance variable can also access class variable, but class variable directly cannot access instance variable or method variable. So that is a way in which we need to understand the concept of scope. Of course, when we start getting into the programming world and get started with writing our programs, it will be more clear for all of us. Now, when we talk about member variable, it is also called as an instance variable, and these variables are managed by the respective objects. They maintain the state, a valid state, which represents some value. For example, if you have a student object, you may have a name, say John. So John is basically a value given to that particular object. I may have another object of type student, and that value is Smith. So the object A is first object which I'm talking is representing John. The second object is representing Smith. Both are students in my system, something like that. So that is what we represent as state. A state of an object is nothing but the value that is basically contained in the variables at a given instant. So that's the basic concept. So how do you manipulate this value inside a variable? So we can use property or methods. So typically these two are used in an object-oriented program like Java for modifying the variable's state. And typically the member variables are private. They are initialized when the object is created, accessed by a get-set method. So we'll discuss about the class definition and all these different elements in the following chapters. And then there can also be a primitive type or a reference type. For example, I can have a variable, say age. So age is any say integer. So integer age is something which you can basically specify as a variable representing a primitive type. Or I can also have an integer object. So when I say integer object or a wrapper class, it is basically a reference variable of reference type. So this is the difference between a variable actually pointing to a primitive data type or a reference data type. So this is about the variables and different variables we use in Java programming environment and different scopes. So in the next chapter, we will look at doing some hands-on. So let's get into some exercises and see how we can basically use variables and literals in a Java program.